Forgotten hero on trial judge, stunned by homeless veteran's identity. Walter Grady, age 66, was a well-known figure in the Brooklyn neighborhood where he had experienced homelessness for over a decade. Thin and marked by exposure, with a silver beard, lacking proper maintenance for years, he consistently carried an aged military-style backpack, faded green canvas with worn straps that had once met regulation standards. Locals perceived him as reserved, unlike other homeless individuals who solicited funds or caused disturbances. Walter maintained a solitary existence. He collected bottles for recycling and occasionally accepted surplus food from empathetic restaurant employees, strategically varying his sleeping locations in doorways to avoid inconveniencing any single establishment. Few were aware that Walter had served honorably in the U.S. Army for more than 20 years, receiving his discharge in 2004. Following the death of his wife Margaret from cancer in 2008, a condition initially misdiagnosed by the VA hospital, Walter succumbed to severe depression. He declined assistance from family, sold their modest apartment, donated the proceeds to his wife's favored charity, and vanished into the anonymity of New York's streets. Sometimes it's easier to be nobody than somebody who failed the person they love most, he once confided to a volunteer at a soup kitchen. On a harsh November afternoon with temperatures plummeting below freezing and snow imminent, Walter sought refuge inside Morelli's Corner Market. Having gone 3 days without sustenance, his hands trembled as he discreetly placed a day-old loaf of bread inside his coat, while Mr. Morelli was assisting another customer. However, Mr. Morelli had recently installed new security mirrors. "Hey, stop right there," he called out, already reaching for the telephone. "I'm calling the cops." Walter did not attempt to flee. He remained stationary, the bread partially visible in his unzipped jacket. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he stated softly. 2 patrol officers arrived within minutes. The younger officer, Jenkins, appeared visibly uncomfortable as he fastened handcuffs on the elderly man's slender wrists. "Are you really a vet?" Jenkins inquired, noticing a dog tag chain around Walter's neck. "This ID looks pretty worn out." Walter nodded. "I used to be someone useful. Not anymore." "Gotta take you in, sir. Store owner's pressing charges," Jenkins said apologetically. "Says you've been caught shoplifting before." At the precinct, Walter was processed in the manner typical for minor offenders. A public defender briefly consulted with him, but seemed primarily focused on case volume rather than understanding his client's situation. Walter was assigned a court date for the subsequent morning, a preliminary hearing for formal charging. Upon morning's arrival, Walter was escorted into Brooklyn's municipal courtroom, still attired in the previous day's clothing, now creased from a night in detention. No family members were present in the gallery, no character witnesses prepared to speak on his behalf. Only a scattering of legal professionals, reporters covering more prominent cases, and court personnel performing their daily duties. Case number 47293, State versus Walter Grady, the clerk announced dispassionately. The young prosecutor rose, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended stealing a loaf of bread from the local market. Given his prior incidents of petty theft and lack of a fixed address, we recommend continued detention pending trial." The judge, the Honorable Michael Carmichael, a man known for his decisive and expeditious judgments, glanced down at the case file, paying scant attention to Walter's presence. Those assembled in the courtroom had in their minds already dismissed the matter as merely another homeless individual navigating the judicial system. "Mr. Grady, how do you plead?" Judge Carmichael inquired, finally looking up. "Guilty, Your Honor," Walter replied softly. "I was hungry." Someone in the back row emitted a muffled snicker. The judge directed a sharp gaze towards that area before returning his attention to the documentation. "Walter Edward Grady, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army." Judge Carmichael's voice trailed off as he read the identification details. A profound silence descended upon the courtroom as the judge's expression underwent a transformation. His hand, gripping the edge of the bench, turned white at the knuckles. He stared intently at Walter, then back at the file, then again at Walter. Without issuing an explanation, Judge Carmichael abruptly stood. The entire courtroom froze in bewilderment. Judges rarely rise during routine hearings. For several prolonged seconds, he remained silent, his countenance a study in controlled emotion. "Your Honor," the prosecutor ventured, uncertain of the proper protocol, when a judge suddenly stands without declaring a recess. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," Judge Carmichael announced, his voice uncharacteristically rough. "The defendant will remain." As the judge exited towards his chambers, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Walter alone remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor, seemingly either oblivious or unconcerned about the extraordinary turn of events his name had just triggered. In his chambers, Judge Michael Carmichael retrieved a worn photograph from his desk drawer, a group of military personnel in desert fatigues, standing before a medical tent in Iraq. His hands trembled slightly as he located himself in the image, 20 years younger, serving as a field medic before pursuing a legal career. And there, standing prominently in the back row, was Walter Grady. The judge accessed his computer and conducted a search through the military database to which he still had access from his previous work with Veteran Affairs. Walter Grady's service record appeared on screen, corroborating the judge's nascent suspicion. Staff Sergeant Walter Grady had completed 3 tours of duty, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, working in logistics, ensuring critical supplies reached forward operating bases during the most perilous phases of both conflicts. He had been awarded the Bronze Star for valor when his convoy was ambushed in 2003. Instead of seeking cover, Walter had deliberately driven a burning supply truck away from wounded personnel, sustaining injuries, but successfully saving 17 lives. The file contained a photograph that had once graced the front page of the New York Times, Walter carrying an injured Afghan child to a medical helicopter during a humanitarian mission. That image had briefly positioned him as a symbol of American compassion amidst warfare before public attention shifted elsewhere. However, what truly captivated the judge's attention was a mission report from July 2003 classified until recently. During a chaotic evacuation under enemy fire, Walter had carried an injured medic, Private First Class Michael Carmichael, 2 miles to safety, despite himself sustaining shrapnel wounds. "My God," the judge whispered. "It's him." Judge Carmichael had spent years attempting to locate the man who had saved his life, but Walter had vanished into civilian life, leaving no forwarding address after his discharge. The judge had never even known his rescuer's full name. Only Grady shouted across the tumult of battle. While the judge processed this profound discovery, Walter sat alone in the courtroom, disregarded by the bailiff who was occupied with his phone during the recess. For 15 years, Walter had existed on the periphery of society, invisible to the very system he had once faithfully served. Following his wife's death, Walter had spiraled into profound grief exacerbated by untreated PTSD. The VA hospital's initial misdiagnosis of Margaret's cancer had fundamentally eroded his trust in institutional systems. When she passed, he had relinquished everything: his benefits, his pension, his very identity. He found the bureaucracy that had failed the person he loved most unbearable. For years, local residents had treated him as an inconvenience. Teenagers occasionally threw food at him. For amusement shop owners used hoses to cleanse sidewalks where he slept, and police officers moved him along when residents lodged complaints. Even other homeless individuals maintained their distance from the quiet man who sometimes awoke screaming from nightmares. Walter subsisted by collecting bottles and cans, earning merely enough to acquire cough medicine when the winter cold afflicted his lungs. He never solicited funds or requested assistance. His military training had instilled a sense of self-reliance that persisted even as his circumstances drastically deteriorated. On his most difficult days, Walter would retrieve the photograph of Margaret he kept wrapped in plastic, shielded from the elements. "Almost there, Maggie," he would whisper, "just holding on a little longer." Back in his chambers, Judge Carmichael initiated a series of urgent telephone calls. First to the VA office, requesting immediate verification of Walter's service record. Then to James Mason, now a colonel who had served alongside both men years prior. "Mason, it's Michael Carmichael. I found him," "The man who pulled me out at Fallujah. He's in my courtroom right now, homeless, charged with stealing bread." The silence on the other end was palpable before Mason responded. "I'm 3 hours away. Don't let him leave." The judge composed a personal note on official letterhead. Walter Grady is not an ordinary homeless man. He is a symbol of loyalty, forgotten by the country he served. Judicial ethics precluded him from dismissing the case solely on the basis of a personal connection, but nothing would prevent him from ensuring justice proceeded along a different course than initially planned. As the recess neared its conclusion, the judge's clerk noticed a document on her desk that had not been there previously. The famous photograph of Walter with the Afghan child and a handwritten note beneath it stating, "Some heroes never ask to be remembered." The clerk recognized the handwriting as Colonel Mason's from prior correspondence with the court concerning veteran affairs. The connection was becoming undeniably clear. Walter Grady was not merely another defendant. He was an individual whose actions had profoundly impacted numerous lives, including those who now held authority over his fate. When court reconvened, Walter immediately sensed the alteration. The judge's demeanor had transformed. The professional detachment had been replaced by something Walter could not quite define: respect, recognition. Before Walter could fully process this shift, the proceedings took an unanticipated turn. In light of new information regarding the defendant's background, this court will postpone further proceedings pending a full investigation, Judge Carmichael announced. The defendant will be remanded to custody until tomorrow's hearing. The prosecutor appeared bewildered but raised no objection. Walter, accustomed to systems making decisions about him without explanation, simply nodded. As Walter was being led away, Judge Carmichael added, "And see that Mr. Grady receives a proper meal and medical attention." That evening, a local news blog published a skeptical headline: "Homeless man claims military hero status. Judge delays sentencing for bread thief." The comments section quickly filled with cynical interpretations. Another street person fabricating stories about being a vet. If he really served, why doesn't he get VA benefits instead of stealing? In the county holding facility, Walter encountered hostility from a young inmate who had read the article on a contraband phone. "Stolen valor is disgusting, old man," he spat, shoving Walter against a wall. "My brother died in Afghanistan, while fakes like you use the uniform to get sympathy." Walter did not retaliate. He merely absorbed the blow, much as he had absorbed society's indifference for years. That night, he did not consume the meal provided. He simply clutched his military ID tags and Margaret's photo, contemplating why, after all this time, someone had truly seen him. The following morning, Walter was escorted back to the courtroom, unaware of the extraordinary events unfolding. Unlike the previous day's nearly empty gallery today, every seat was occupied. News cameras awaited outside, prohibited from entering, but eager to capture the subsequent proceedings. Walter's confusion deepened when he observed that his public defender had been replaced by a distinguished older attorney who introduced himself as Richard Harlow from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. "Someone's taken an interest in your case, Mr. Grady," Harlow explained, offering no further specifics. As Walter took his seat at the defense table, he heard the courtroom doors open. The audience rose as Judge Carmichael entered, but Walter's attention was drawn to 3 military officers in full-dress uniforms who had entered behind the court officers. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Carmichael," the bailiff announced. The proceedings commenced with unusual formality, the judge's demeanor markedly different from the previous day. "Before we address the charges against Mr. Grady, the court will hear relevant testimony pertaining to the defendant's background, which may influence these proceedings." Walter stared in confusion as Colonel James Mason approached the witness stand. Although 20 years older than when Walter had last seen him, Mason's military bearing remained unmistakable. After being sworn in, Mason addressed the court with practiced precision. "I am Colonel James Mason, currently stationed at Fort Hamilton. I have known the defendant, Staff Sergeant Walter Grady, since our deployment to Iraq in 2003. The colonel turned to face Walter directly. "This man before you saved the lives of teen soldiers when our convoy was ambushed near Fallujah. While under heavy fire, he drove a burning fuel truck away from our position, sustaining second-degree burns, but preventing an explosion that would have killed us all." Murmurs spread through the courtroom as Mason continued. Staff Sergeant Grady later carried a wounded medic, a young private first class named Michael Carmichael, 2 miles to safety despite shrapnel wounds to his own leg. At this revelation, all eyes shifted towards Judge Carmichael, whose professional composure momentarily faltered as he nodded in confirmation. The prosecutor stood clearly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, while this testimony speaks to the defendant's past character, it does not alter the fact that he committed theft." "If I may continue," Colonel Mason interjected. "After reviewing Mr. Grady's file, we have discovered a significant administrative error. Due to a system migration in 2008, Walter Grady's pension and benefits were erroneously terminated when he did not respond to paperwork sent to an outdated address. He has been entitled to approximately $1,370 per month for the past 15 years, plus medical care for service-related injuries. That totals over $246,000 in unpaid benefits." The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the full implication became clear. Walter himself appeared, bewildered, his weathered hands gripping the table edge. "Furthermore," Mason added, producing a folder, "we have affidavits from 5 members of your old unit, all attesting to your character and service, including this letter from General Richards, who credits you with saving his son during that same ambush." Judge Carmichael addressed Walter directly for the first time. "Mr. Grady, would you please approach the bench?" As Walter stood uncertainly, the judge continued. "Protocol would typically prevent me from presiding over a case involving someone with whom I have a personal connection. However, I did not recognize you yesterday, and only after reviewing your file did I realize you were the man who saved my life in Iraq." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The judge removed his glasses, his formal demeanor softening. "I've spent nearly 2 decades trying to locate you to thank you. I never knew your full name, just Grady," shouted across the battlefield. Walter's voice when he finally spoke was rough from disuse. "I was just doing my job, sir." "You did far more than your job," the judge responded, "and this country has failed to do its job for you." Judge Carmichael turned to the prosecutor. "In light of these extraordinary circumstances, does the state wish to proceed with charges?" The young prosecutor, now visibly moved, stood. "Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Grady with prejudice." "So ordered," the judge responded immediately. "Mr. Grady, you are free to go. This court extends its deepest apologies for the miscarriage of justice that has extended far beyond these proceedings." As Walter stood in stunned silence, the back doors of the courtroom opened again. A woman in her 30s entered, her eyes searching until they located Walter. She approached slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Uncle Walter," she said, "I'm Rebecca Margaret's niece. We've been looking for you for years." Walter's composure finally fractured. His shoulders sagged as Rebecca embraced him, the first human contact he had experienced in years that was not from law enforcement officers placing him in handcuffs. Outside the courtroom, reporters extended microphones toward Colonel Mason. "This is not just about one veteran," he stated firmly. "This is about thousands of Walter Gradys who fall through the cracks in a system they defended. Today we begin making this right." By afternoon, the story had gained widespread attention. News helicopters hovered over the courthouse as Walter emerged clean-shaven and wearing donated clothes, flanked by Colonel Mason and Judge Carmichael, now recused from the case but present as a private citizen. Mr. Morelli, the store owner who had pressed charges, pushed through reporters to reach Walter. "I didn't know," he said, visibly shaken. "I saw you as just another troublemaker. I'm ashamed now." Walter simply nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Within 48 hours, a veterans organization established a fund for Walter that quickly exceeded $200,000 in donations. Social media platforms featured a surge of similar accounts of veterans who had experienced systemic failures, prompting the VA to announce a review of terminated benefits cases. In a private moment away from cameras, Judge Carmichael finally had the conversation he had awaited for 20 years. "You carried me for 2 miles with shrapnel in your leg," he said quietly. "The medics said you refused treatment until they stabilized me." Walter shrugged. You were worse off than me. You said something to me that day when I was drifting in and out of consciousness. You said, "Just keep breathing, kid, your story isn't over." Those words kept me alive, kept me fighting. I became a judge because I wanted to continue serving like you did. Walter looked at the judge, no longer seeing the authority figure in robes, but the frightened young medic from his memories. "I'm glad something good came from that day." "Not just something good," the judge replied. "Everything good in my life since then, my career, my family, my chance to make a difference, it all exists because you didn't leave me behind." For the first time in years, Walter smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "No man left behind." That wasn't just a saying for me. 3 days later, Walter stood in the judge's chambers wearing a new suit. His military decorations were finally displayed on his chest. The Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and other ribbons narrating the history of his service. A Veterans Affairs representative formally presented him with his back benefits and an additional settlement for the administrative error. As cameras documented the moment, Walter spoke publicly for the first time. "I don't want anyone's pity. I just hope that those who come after won't be forgotten like I was." The story transcended a local human interest piece to become a national conversation regarding America's treatment of its veterans. Legislators referenced Walter's case when introducing bills to reform the benefits system. The photograph of Walter carrying the Afghan child circulated again, this time alongside the image of him homeless on Brooklyn streets, a powerful juxtaposition that compelled uncomfortable questions about national priorities. Walter Grady, who had been invisible for 15 years, had suddenly become impossible to overlook. 6 months later, Walter relocated to Veterans Village, a supportive housing community in Brooklyn. His small apartment, the first place he could genuinely call home since Margaret's death, contained few possessions, but featured a wall dedicated to photographs. Margaret on their wedding day, his old unit in Iraq, and a new image of him with Judge Carmichael at a veterans recognition ceremony. Walter declined most interview requests but agreed to speak at local schools about military service and the challenges veterans encounter upon returning home. His quiet dignity and straightforward manner resonated particularly with troubled teenagers who found in him neither judgment nor condescension, only honest accounts of both heroism and hardship. Each afternoon, Walter could be found at Prospect Park sitting on a bench and observing children play. Sometimes the very bench where he had once slept when the weather was too severe for his usual doorways. Outside the Brooklyn courthouse, a new bronze plaque was installed. "Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten." Alongside this inscription stood a relief sculpture depicting Walter carrying the wounded medic who would become Judge Carmichael, with the American flag as a backdrop. During the dedication ceremony, the mayor announced the creation of an annual fund to provide legal assistance specifically for homeless veterans, named the Grady Initiative. A 10-year-old boy who had often seen Walter collecting bottles wrote an essay for his school newspaper, "Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead." The essay won a citywide competition and was read aloud at a city council meeting addressing homelessness policy. Walter maintained a friendship with Judge Carmichael, occasionally joining his family for Sunday dinners. During one such evening, the judge's son inquired if Walter was angry about having been homeless for so long. Walter considered the question carefully before responding. "I don't need anyone's pity. I just hope those who come after will remember those who came before." On Veterans Day, Walter stood before a crowd at Fort Hamilton, wearing his dress uniform for the first time in decades. When invited to make remarks, he spoke briefly but powerfully. "I once protected this country. Now the country has protected me back." His voice strengthened as he continued. "Kindness is never too late. It just needs someone patient enough to wait for it." As he stepped down from the podium, the assembled military personnel, from young recruits to aging veterans, rose in silent salute. Walter straightened his posture and returned the gesture, his eyes clear and dignified, no longer directed at the ground but forward towards the future. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent.